Any serious discussion of Unitarian Universalist theology must at some point make reference to the 5 smooth stones of liberal religion. Whereas the 7 principles are a covenant between UU congregations in terms of values that we promise to uphold, and only glancingly involve theology in the 1st and 7th principles, the 5 smooth stones were developed by Unitarian minister and activist James Luther Adams in order to identify the theological essentials of our liberal religion. Now, you've heard me refer to the 5 smooth stones a number of times in recent years, but let me refresh your memories as to how they came into being. During the 1930s, Adams spent some time in Germany, and on one occasion was visiting a friend, a distinguished philosopher whom Adams considered to be a leading progressive. He happened to refer to his friend as a liberal, and was taken aback by the most immediate and visceral denial. It wasn't until that moment that Adams understood the extent of the assault on liberalism by the rising fascist regime of 1930s Germany, and as an apologist for liberal religion, he realized he had to find some way to respond. The result was the 5 smooth stones, a name apparently given to Adams' list of the theological essentials of Unitarian Universalism by one of his biographers. The name is a reference to the biblical story of David and Goliath, specifically the part where David selects 5 smooth stones from a streambed to arm his sling before he goes to face Goliath. And that apparently suited Adams' intent just fine, because in distinguishing liberal religion from political liberalism and possessive individualism and authoritarian corporatism, each of these theological essentials served to defend against the Philistines of fascism, communism, neo-orthodox Christianity, university intellectualism, and anti-intellectual conservatism. In the decades since Adams' essays on liberalism were published, we can add to the list of its attackers the religious right, talk radio and television so-called news that exploits fear and small-mindedness for personal and corporate gain, and now the so-called alt-right, which is merely a euphemism for anti-Semitic, misogynistic white supremacists. In your order of service, you'll find a summary of the 5 smooth stones, and since today is Advent Sunday and we lit the candle of hope on the Advent wreath, I want to draw your attention to the 5th stone, namely hope. The human and cosmic resources for meaningful personal and social transformation justify ultimate optimism. At the depths of human nature and at the boundaries of what we are, there are potential resources that can prevent a retreat into nihilism. What are some of these resources? Well, there are the other 4 stones, for starters. Continuous revelation is a source of hope in that we can always discover new truths and better ways of living. Under the winter's snow, there is always greenery waiting to emerge. Covenant offers the hope of relationships built on free and mutual consent rather than coercion, and says that relationships built on consent are better. Justice lifts up the hope of freedom and equality. And agency puts front and center the hope of a community that incarnates virtue, so that justice and compassion and human dignity may be realized. The human and cosmic resources for meaningful personal and social transformation justify ultimate optimism. We need that just now, and not simply because it's Advent Sunday and we've lit the candle of hope on the Advent wreath, though it's hardly an accident that the first candle we light is for hope. No, we particularly need hope right now when the liberal foundations of our society are under renewed attack, when misogynists and white supremacists like Steve Bannon are being lined up to run the executive branch of the US government come January. So a couple of weeks ago, I was at the Mountain, a Unitarian Universalist retreat and learning centre in far western North Carolina. I was there, as was our student minister Walter Clark, for the twice-a-year meeting of the Southeast UU Ministers Association, and it was certainly good to be with colleagues as we continued to process the election. Our featured presenter for the week was the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison-Reed, who is the author of a number of books that are essential reading for anyone serious about knowing UU history, including Black Pioneers in a White Denomination and the Selma Awakening, how the civil rights movement tested and changed Unitarian Universalism. In the course of his workshop sessions, which I'll get back to in a moment, Mark commented on the fact that the various surveys of individual UUs that the Unitarian Universalist Association has conducted over the decades have consistently ranked intellectual stimulation as the highest priority when it comes to services. That's no great surprise. One of the most frequent comments I hear as people leave the sanctuary after I've preached is, "You've given me lots to think about." And I love that you are willing to keep thinking about what I've said, even if what I'd be truly thrilled to hear is a comment more like, "You've made me want to go and burn down the patriarchy." But Mark didn't stop by telling us something that's no great surprise, of course. He went on to say that if you separate those survey results by race, then it's only true that intellectual stimulation is a priority for white UUs. For UUs of colour, particularly African American UUs, the priorities are instead celebration of common values and a close second, hope. And really, for any white person who's paid the slightest bit of attention in the last few years, that's no great surprise either. When you live every day wondering if your next interaction with the police, if your child's next interaction with the police will turn deadly, you need a whole lot more than intellectual stimulation to get you to leave the house. Now, most of Mark's workshops last week were on the subject of religious ritual. At first glance, of course, ritual is still something of a dirty word amongst UUs today, particularly if we only understand ritual to mean prescribed ceremonies that are rigidly followed and offer no warmth or deeper meaning. However, in the course of Mark's workshops, we quickly realized that today's Unitarian Universalism is steeped in ritual, from lighting the chalice and candles to singing the children out and our other sung responses, from times of silence to passing the offering basket. No longer are UU services a university lecture and some classical music. From greeting people as they come through the door to holding hands at the end of a service, everything is intended to deepen the spirituality of community. Then, Mark's final workshop was a review of UU involvement in the civil rights movement, how we went to Selma, and from the high of marching with Dr. King, how we fell to the low of broken promises to African American UUs. The parallels with our own time, some 50 years later, are striking. After all, we find ourselves in a dangerously similar position now, having made a commitment to the Black Lives Matter movement at General Assembly 2 summers ago, and then being called to account at GA this summer for not having really done anything to follow through on that commitment. Mark's point, though, was that when UUs were engaged in the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s, we had no sense of ritual, no spiritual grounding for our work, no religious context. We were, to all intents and purposes, unrelated individuals who happened to show up to the same event with little congregational or denominational identity to bind us together, next to no spiritual or religious resources to ground us. It's a crying shame that James Reeb is merely known as a priest from Boston, instead of as a UU minister who gave his life to stand up for civil rights. Mark's point was that we have those resources now, so we don't have to make the same mistakes. The human and cosmic resources for meaningful personal and social transformation justify ultimate optimism. At the depths of human nature and at the boundaries of what we are, there are potential resources that can prevent a retreat into nihilism. We need that ultimate optimism, that hope, right now. So what do? How do we cope with the seemingly endless barrage of bad news? Well, first must come your personal defense against the negativity. You're no use to anybody else if you're thoroughly beaten down yourself. Stepping away from the news, from social media, whatever you need to do to shore up your own emotional well-being is okay. Okay, that is, in the short term. In the long term, spiritual health comes from being engaged in making a difference for good, not simply disengaging to avoid the bad. So go watch funny cat videos if that's what it takes to cheer you up when you're down. But once you're feeling better again, roll up your sleeves because you've got work to do. Remember that Advent, as a season of looking for Christmas to arrive, is not about passively waiting for some miracle that will solve all of our problems for us, but is about active and engaged preparation for what is to come. And if you're feeling outraged, don't shy away from that. The 4th century bishop, Augustine of Hippo, who set the course of Christian theology for almost 1,000 years, wrote that hope has 2 beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. Much more than mere feelings, Augustine understood these as virtues. After all, we generally think of anger as bad, and if it leads to violence and hatred, then it is. But if it motivates someone to address the cause of their anger in a positive way, then it can do good. By the same token, we similarly think of courage as good, but it too can be misapplied as foolish recklessness. As virtues, they're all about how you put them to use. So if we don't want to feel helpless, then we can create hope by doing something that makes a difference. As activist Dorothy Day put it, no one has a right to sit down and feel hopeless. There's too much work to do. So what can you do? Well, there are a number of things to choose from. This Wednesday, we're hosting a meeting led by Planned Parenthood, which we're helping to support through today's Share the Basket offering. The meeting, titled United Against Hate, is an opportunity to support each other, debrief, and plan for the fight ahead. With Planned Parenthood having turned 100 years old in October, it's about ensuring their work continues to advocate for women's health and safety, to provide sexual and reproductive health care, and to advance the right to make informed and responsible choices. So please come to that meeting this Wednesday here in the sanctuary at 7 o'clock. What else? Something that's received renewed attention the last couple of weeks is putting up a Black Lives Matter banner on the side of our building. But as UUFP President Sandy Burks-Campbell wrote in the letter sent to members on Friday, there is much to do in our community and the world, and displaying a banner is only the beginning of the work we are called to do. Yes, we should put up a banner, but it's not like planting a flag when we've reached the top of a mountain and all that's left to do is go home. No, it should be a sign that we're serious about anti-racism work, that we're involved with the NAACP, that we're leading a local chapter of Showing Up for Racial Justice, that we have a significant sustained involvement with the Boys and Girls Club that's right next door. A banner without that real work behind it is just a cheap and empty promise. What else? You can join the Women's March on Washington on January 21st. The Social Justice Committee is talking about chartering a bus from here to DC, so they need to know that you're interested in going. I mentioned this briefly 2 weeks ago, so here I'll read what the organisers of the march have written about it. On January 21st, 2017, we will unite in Washington, D.C. for the Women's March on Washington. We stand together in solidarity with our partners and children for the protection of our rights, our safety, our health, and our families, recognizing that our vibrant and diverse communities are the strength of our country. They go on to explain. The rhetoric of the past election cycle has insulted, demonized, and threatened many of us, women, immigrants of all statuses, those with diverse religious faiths, particularly Muslim, people who identify as LGBTQ, native and indigenous people, black and brown people, people with disabilities, the economically impoverished, and survivors of sexual assault. We are confronted with the question of how to move forward in the face of national and international concern and fear. They continue. In the spirit of democracy and honouring the champions of human rights, dignity and justice who have come before us, we join in diversity to show our presence in numbers too great to ignore. The Women's March on Washington will send a bold message to our new administration on their first day in office and to the world that women's rights are human rights. We stand together, recognizing that defending the most marginalized among us is defending all of us. And they conclude, we support the advocacy and resistance movements that reflect our multiple and intersecting identities. We call on all defenders of human rights to join us. This march is the first step towards unifying our communities, grounded in new relationships, to create change from the grassroots level up. We will not rest until women have parity and equity at all levels of leadership in society. We work peacefully while recognizing there is no true peace without justice and equity for all. Again, this is an inclusive event, and everyone who supports women's rights is welcome. So if you're interested in a seat on the bus from here to Washington, please let the Social Justice Committee know. Oh, and taking Mark Morrison Reed's lesson to heart, I want to put our participation in the march in a religious context, to give it spiritual grounding, and yes, even bring some ritual to it. We are not just unrelated individuals who will happen to show up to the same event. We will be engaging as a congregation. What about other actions? Well, there's something as seemingly simple as wearing a safety pin. Now, this has older roots as a way to show that you're a safe person who can be called upon by someone who is the target of oppression. But it's received renewed attention as a way of responding to the spike in violence against immigrants and other manifest bigotry following the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. Be warned, though, if you do your own reading on wearing safety pins, that there are some fake fights going on over this, as well as the threat of infiltration from white supremacists. So wear your safety pin with your Black Lives Matter button. And I have a few left if anybody wants to wear one. And is anybody as outraged as I am that I've now had to mention white supremacists 3 times in this sermon? As explained in the graphics in your order of service insert, wearing a safety pin is not about passively waiting for someone to ask you for help, putting the onus on them so that you can graciously rescue them. Rather, the onus is on you to be proactive and engaged. There's even a guide as to how to put the promise you make by wearing a safety pin into practice, specifically in the case of Islamophobic harassment, for which the guide's creator Merrill is quite happy to be applied to dealing with other forms of harassment too. This guide is the graphic on the back of your order of service insert. Just be aware, though, that if you are a man, approaching a woman who is already being harassed might come across as additional intimidation, given that, in all likelihood, the person doing the harassing is going to be male. So remember that you can always do what an anonymous man did on a New York subway a few years ago, breaking up a fight by simply standing between the people who were fighting and casually eating a bag of potato chips. Finally, remember that as a community, we're here to offer hope directly to one another too. We have our values, our virtues, and when we engage in fake fights, we diminish them. That's one of the reasons I don't like making big decisions by simply voting on them, unless we've already done the work necessary to get everyone onto the same page so that the vote is little more than a formality to dot the I's and cross the T's. Our biggest commitment, encompassing all the details of the 7 promises, is that we stay in dialogue even when we disagree. As a community, we're here to offer one another comfort and support, a note of hope that sustains us during difficult times. This, right here, is amongst our biggest human and cosmic resources for meaningful personal and social transformation that justify ultimate optimism. Back in September then, I invited everyone present at services one Sunday to write kind words on a piece of paper. We had talked in that service about the damage that unkind words can do, travelling like feathers on the wind to places beyond our control and beyond our ability to take them back. Well, words of kindness and hope could be offered up in that way too. So I invited you to write such words on paper feathers, not knowing who would eventually read them. We put all the feathers in this jar, our own community jar of words written in kindness, and as of today, we're going to leave it outside the door into this sanctuary. Whenever you need a little encouragement, a little hope, feel free to pull out a feather and read it. Everyone has something to contribute to community, if only a smile. If you need to take it with you, you are welcome to do so. But otherwise, you can put it back in the jar for another person to read another time. As poet Emily Dickinson put it, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. May that song always be ready to offer us a note of hope whenever we need it. So may it be.